Good morning, everybody. Are you out there, YouTube? Are you out there, color grading lunatics? I hope you are. It's good to see you guys. I'm fired up for another Grade School Friday, another fun Friday morning. Hope everyone's having an awesome week. I'm having an awesome week. I'm figuring out how to be a dad, figuring out how to take care of my kid, figuring out how to get sleep where I can. All positive things, all trending up in the right direction. And I'm really fired up to hang out with you guys today, talk about color grading, because I'm technically on paternity leave and I haven't gotten to do so much grading. Loving hanging out with my kid, but as you guys know, I love color grading. So I'm excited for any excuse to spend a little bit more time talking about these things and hanging out with you guys. So we got a fun session for today. For today, I thought we could continue with what we started on last week, which is really just answering questions from the first part of our DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow video, which came out last week. You may have noticed part 2 has yet to come out this week. That's because of aforementioned dad duties and figuring out how to balance all of my priorities. So that'll be coming out this coming week. But in the meanwhile, you guys brought a ton of great questions into grade school last week. And we definitely didn't get to all of them, or even as much of a fraction of them as we usually do. So I thought we could spend another really productive hour today on continuing to answer those questions just from part 1, so that we can go into part 2 with as strong as possible of a foundation. So let's dive right into it. I am going to take a look at a few that I noticed right after we wrapped up last week that we didn't get a chance to get to, that I thought were particularly good ones for us to get straight on before we move forward. So this first one that I wanted to take a look at, let me see here. Here we go. So we had a good question from Ahmed, who asks, is it better to do the look in scene referred or display referred? And this is one of those times where I wish we were all sitting in one room and we could make some eye contact and, like have a more normal classroom setting, because I'm going to hold off on answering that for just a moment and ask all of you to think about it and chime in on your answer in the chat if you so wish, although the lag tends to make that a foregone conclusion by the time it actually shows up on my end. But that's the question. Is it better to do our look in display referred space or in scene referred space? Think about that for just a second. Answer to yourself, answer in your own head, and then we're going to take a look at, I'll give you my answer to that in just a moment, okay? Okay, spoiler alert. It is better to do our look in scene referred space. Why is that? Well, let's think about a workflow or a hypothetical that we've talked a lot about here in grade school, and I talk about in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments, which I highly recommend picking up if you want to get a better grasp on all of the concepts that are driving every single lesson and video and idea that I'm going to be sharing with you guys on the channel. The best place to get those distilled down into a nice, digestible fashion is to pick up the Colorist 10 Commandments. You can get it on my website, cullenkellycolor.com. We've got links to it in the description. That's the best place to get a grasp on the overall concepts that are driving my thinking, because believe it or not, I have a reason for every single thing that I do and that I say as a colorist. And I think that's really all of our job as artists, is not to do things just because we think they work or because someone else told us that they work, but because we know that they work and because we've chosen this solution and not that solution or any other. So why is it better to do our look in scene referred space versus display space? The reason is, if we think about my hypothetical example that I often make of, okay, I've got a client who comes in and they want to do a grade on their film or their commercial, and we do the grade and everyone's pumped and we get it done. We deliver all the Rec 709 assets and it's out the door, the check clears, everyone's happy. A month later, they come back and they say, hey, we loved your work so much, we actually want to do an HDR version of this project. What do you say? Can we fit that in? And you say, sure. And you go back in and you realize that if you haven't set up your workflow properly, if it wasn't in place correctly from the beginning of your project, you actually don't have a way of translating the creative intent that is embodied in that Rec 709 master into an HDR space. You have to manually eye match things shot by shot by shot. And here's the truth, guys. There's actually 2 reasons why this is really problematic. The first one is a little bit more obvious. We don't want to do unnecessary work, right? If we're trying to be professional colorists, we want to be as efficient with our time as possible. And if there's a way to avoid unnecessary work, then we should look for it for sure, right? There's another reason that's almost as important in this scenario, and that is this. When you raise that specter of doubt and when your client understands, oh, we're actually popping the hood again and we are regrading this, so to speak, that specter of doubt is a really, really bad energy to have in the space, because now instead of making little adjustments and trims to get a best reproduction of what you did in SDR in HDR, you're now chasing something and you're now wondering, am I getting the match? Is it good enough? Is it close enough? Has something moved? You're kind of in this defensive posture. You're in this very anxious space of trying to figure out how to protect what you already thought you had. That's a bad space even for colorists who know our way around color grading software. And if you put yourself in the POV of your client, imagine how overwhelming that is, because they don't know what you're doing. They don't understand Resolve. They don't understand color grading. All they know is they don't want to lose any of the creative intent that they were already able to get in the Rec 709. And it's a really, really tough energy to work with when you are doing that master. So not only is it unnecessary work, it's unnecessary work that is going to be haunted by really problematic energy. So that's all a big tangent of saying, if we set up our workflow in such a way that we are doing anything that should happen in scene space, in display space, we're tying our own hands for down the line. That's why we want to do our look in scene space, because if we do, as we've done here in my Resolve project, let me flip over and show this to you guys. If we take a look here, here in this timeline that we've been working in for the last couple grade schools and pre-recorded videos, I've got my timeline and my color management set up as I did in DaVinci Wide Gamut Workflows Part 1. And I've also got my look set up as I set up in that same video. This look is happening at the scene or in the working space level, like so. So I can just flip these two LUTs off and on, which are giving me respectively the tone or the contrast component of my look and the palette or the sort of color component of the look. What's great about this is, let's take this hypothetical scenario. The client comes back and they say, okay, we've done the SDR, the Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. Now we want to do the HDR. Okay, I'm just going to go to P3D65 ST2084 1000 nit, common spec for HDR deliverables. Now, when I hit save, this image is no longer going to look correct on my display because I'm not monitoring on an HDR display. However, my creative intent, if I were to tee this up on my external HDR monitor here, it would be preserved and it would be well matched in the new HDR space, because everything about this grade, up to and including the look, is happening at the scene level prior to that output transform. So if I need to output to something different, I can just flip that switch and that exact same stack of operations is simply going to be pointed at a new destination. So long answer, but a really good question, and something that we definitely want to be straight on as we continue forward through our DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow exercise. And let's see if my buddy Rafa is here with me. Rafa, I've just admitted you to the party. Give us a shout if you can hear us. Okay, I can see that you're talking, I think. Hang tight one sec, buddy. Rafa, you with me, brother? Well, that's annoying. Hang tight, gang. Let me figure out. Oh, here we go.
Colin, can you hear me?
There you are.
Okay, I cannot hear you for some reason.
Hang tight.
Okay, maybe now.
Okay, buddy. How about now?
Okay, I can hear you. All right.
Okay, and I think we can all hear you. Welcome to the party, buddy. How you doing?
Well, I barely made it this time, so I'm fine. Let's go to the question straight up.
Good deal. Yeah, for sure. So we just hit one. Let's see what we got out there. I haven't looked at the chat today to see if we have any others, but we are just to catch you up. We're doing trying to catch up on any questions we didn't get to last week on part 1 of DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow.
All right, let's go to this one from Michael. Why lift, gain, and offset are not having a linear impact on the image on DaVinci Wide Gamut?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm going to endeavor to keep my answer brief. So there's sort of a short list, a kind of a dictionary of words that I use a lot here in grade school and in my pre-recorded videos as well. One of those words is linear. Linear is an important word, but linear also can mean a lot of different stuff. So we want to get clear on what exactly it means. So let's just do a quick demonstration, okay? I just want to very, very quickly recap for you guys something that I've talked about a lot in grade school. How do lift, gamma, and gain change in terms of their mathematical operation as we move between DaVinci Wide Gamut or ACES or scene referred or display referred or HDR or SDR? How do those change in all those different settings? Anybody know? Think about it, answer to yourself, sound it out in the chat if the lag isn't too brutal. How do those change? They don't change. The math is always, 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 always the same. Lift, gamma, gain, offset, anything here in your primaries, this math doesn't change, okay? Gain is always multiplication. Offset is always addition and subtraction. Gamma is always a power function. Lift is always upside down gain. So instead of pivoting with everything around 0, we're pivoting around 1 with lift. That never changes. Now, the question being asked is a good one. Why does it not affect the image in a linear way? Why doesn't it feel the same? I assume when we're asking that question, we're asking why it doesn't feel the same compared to what it feels like when I'm operating on an image in a gamma or a display state. Well, that's because we're operating on our image in a log state, which is in fact non-linear. So the non-linearity of the thing, unless we're actually operating on a linear image state itself, we're never going to get a strictly speaking linear response with our lift, gamma, and gain because we're going to be operating on our image, which is in some sort of curved encoding. But the reason for the difference between the way these controls feel in, like a scene space versus, I'm just going to flip my output transform back over here. The way those things feel in a scene space versus in a display space versus, HDR or whatever is because of the state of the image and the response that we get when we manipulate it. So that's why there's a difference there, and why, for starters, you guys heard me talk about offset being a pretty good analog for exposure in a display space. But check out, you can see even as I drop my exposure way down to like a 12, I'm getting a little clumpy at the bottom there, but I'm generally getting an iris-like behavior in my image. If I turn that off and let's see, I want to go to, I'm going to flip my color management for a moment just so I can show you guys something. So instead of color managing at the project level, I'm going to color manage at the node level, like so. So we're going to say outs, and one of these days I'm actually going to prep some updated color space transforms. But for now, I'm just going to manually say, we're going from DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. And I'm also going to want to prep an input transform for this shot because this shot is in log C. So we're going to say log C to, let's do this. Log C to DaVinci Wide Gamut. Okay, so now I've got that exact same color pipeline that I had built out at my project level here in a pair of nodes. So we're happening with this in node, and then we would do all of our grading in between. And then we've got this final out node, or this 709 node that is the finishing touch. So a moment ago, I was demonstrating okay, here's how offset looks and feels when I operate on my image in the appropriate place, in between my input and my output transform. Let's compare that to what would happen if I were to do the exact same offset operation here in my display state. Doesn't feel the same. You can even see it here on the scopes. We've crashed hard into the floor. We've clipped into the floor. So that's, I assume, what we're asking about when we say, why is the response not linear? It's actually not linear in either case, but the reason for the discrepancy is because of the difference in image state and the way that the image responds to the operation depending on that state. So it's just kind of a shorthand that you'll get used to. And I don't really grade in display space ever, but if I were to, I would go into it knowing, okay, offset is not going to be my friend in display space. In display space, lift, gamma, and gain are going to be my go-tos because I don't want to clip anything out, and offset is going to very easily do that. Whereas when I'm in a scene space or a log space, the tools are different, the behavior is different, the response is different, and I'm going to select a different set of tools than I would were I back in a display, sort of display referred grading paradigm, if that makes sense.
Okay, speaking of linear, let's go to linear light. Can you use power windows in linear light?
Hell yeah, you can. I love using power windows in linear light. In fact, that's my you guys may know from having watched my other videos, I've got a couple of sort of rules when it comes to using power windows. And one of them is that I very, very rarely am going to use a power window to do something. I want to use a power window to negate something, to trim something. So I always am thinking about power windows in a negative direction. I'm going to use them to try to trim and shape and control light as opposed to introducing light. Introducing light is something that I'm most likely to do at the base exposure level. So like, the super common example that you guys have seen me talk about before, if I'm on this shot and I'm like, oh, I want to window her face and bring it up. It's like, well, that sounds to me like your exposure is not right. What would you be exposing for if not the face in the middle of the frame, right? So let's start with getting the exposure right. And if that causes everything else around her to come up, let's just kind of demo that out real quick. Like let's do some offset like we talked about in our video. And let's say I like that exposure for her face. And then we could say that we don't like the level that everything around her has gone to. What I could do is a new circular power window, sort of roughly outline her, make it nice and soft like I always do. We're going to flip that so that we are operating on everything outside of her as opposed to on the shape itself. And then if I have my color management, let me set my timeline color space to DaVinci Wide Gamut so that the next thing I do behaves properly. Now I can right click here and select linear for my gamma. And that's going to work properly because I have the proper timeline color space set up in my project settings. And now I can just do my linear gain like so. Now that's a little aggressive already there, but let's go somewhere where I can get rid of this window. Here we go. So that's not the sneakiest or the most artful window I've ever drawn, but it totally works. And in that, like I said, that in fact is my probably most typical form of using a power window. I'm going to use it to trim, use it to take heat off of some geometric portion of the frame, and I usually am going to do it with linear gain. You could do it, as we talked about in the pre-recorded video last week, you could totally do this with offset. And if you guys, anyone who hasn't seen me demo this before or doesn't know what I'm talking about, you don't need to understand what I'm showing you right now. You could just as easily do a use timeline gamma, and instead of gain, do offset and get virtually identical results. Linear gain is technically a bit more photometric, a bit more consistent when you are working in different working spaces. You're going to get the same response, but you could also do this with offset and log. Or this kind of connects back up to our prior question about like the behavior of lift, gamma, and gain in different spaces. When we are in a linear space, gain is no longer a contrast adjustment. Gain is an exposure adjustment. So that's why when I move into linear and when I adjust my gain, I'm effectively adjusting exposure, and I'm technically doing so in a bit more of a photometric way and in a way that won't change depending on whatever log curve I might be working in natively. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, a question from Marcus Finhold regarding color mapping. How does the gamut mapping and tone mapping work if you do it in the project settings? Is there a place to enable it, or is it enabled by default?
Oh, good question. So let's take a look. So the question is, how does the gamut mapping work if we are managing not in nodes the way that I set up a couple minutes ago here, but if we're actually managing things in our project settings like I had initially. So let's go back over to our color management and take a look at that. So we're going to say no automatic color management, HDR DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. You guys are going to get sick of seeing me do all this stuff before we're said and done. So the way to get more insight into what's happening inside of our pipeline when we set it up here in our project settings is to go to our custom mode down here at the bottom of our color processing mode. And this is where we can sort of articulate control over all of those pieces. So you can see here, I've still got my timeline color space set to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. I'm basically just looking at the spelled out version of what this HDR DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate preset was already giving me. And you can see within here that my output gamut is being limited to my output color space. Now, Marco actually asks a really good question that, to be honest with you, I hadn't thought about before. I would assume that what's happening here is that we are not just, when it says limit output gamut, I would assume that the sensible default that's being invoked here is gamut mapping, meaning that as we're approaching the edge of the most saturated colors that Rec 709 is capable of reproducing, we are gently rolling things off as colors approach there, as opposed to saying, you hit the wall, you're clipped, you're gone, you're done. I assume that we are gamut mapping or saturation mapping in Resolve's language, as opposed to just hard clipping those values. And you could test that with a little bit of testing, you could confirm that. But that would be my assumption here, because if we look at, like back to my manual node here, in terms of our gamut mapping, it's pretty simple in Resolve. We really only have one flavor of true gamut mapping. Everything else, it's either none or clip, neither of which are going to produce very pleasing results with values that are getting close to that edge. So since saturation compression is really the only flavor of gamut mapping that Resolve has to offer, I'm going to make the educated assumption that that is exactly what's being done here in my color management when I say limit my output gamut to, let's go back to this drop down here. What's the language? Yeah, when I say limit output gamut to output color space, I assume that it's not clipping me to that output color space, but that it's actually saturation mapping like we see here, and probably with these stock default values. So that's a guess, but a pretty good one.
Okay, short question. If I'm understanding this correctly, scene space just means everything in the pipe prior to the output. Everything after the output is considered display?
That's exactly right. Yeah, and we use it here on the channel, and you'll find in general in color grading communities, it's a pretty loose term. Like technically scene space would mean linear camera encoding, but when I say it and when most people say it, what they're really referring to is big high dynamic range, wide gamut without anything having been clipped or transformed for display yet. So that's a very good working definition. Scene space is everything right up until we actually transform our image for display. Display space is everything that happens after that transformation takes place.
Can I use Resolve Film LUTs when mastering into HDR?
No, you can't. And it's a good question, and I wish I had a better answer for you. So we've talked about this a bit in prior episodes of Grade School, but let's just quickly recap why that is. So the promise of color management, among other things, as we talked about earlier today even, is that with color management, we can grade in a unified space. We can get a reasonable best initial match between different cameras, for example, and then we can output our creative intent to whatever display we happen to be mastering on that day, right? So I'm on SDR today, maybe I'm on HDR tomorrow, maybe I'm doing a theatrical print the following day. I can target these different outputs without fundamentally needing to rework my grade. That's the promise of color management. These Resolve Film LUTs, like most legacy film look, like actual profile LUTs, they contain not only a creative or a preferential component where we're getting all of this contrast and filmy colorimetry and stuff, they contain a display transform because film prints contain a display transform, don't they? Film prints are intended to take a log state camera negative and transform it into a display state or a gamma state or a projector state for actual viewing. So these contain a display transformation. So, and you can see it right here in the name, Rec 709 Kodak 2383 D65. So once I use this LUT, I've pushed myself into display space. To go back to the prior question, I'm no longer in scene space. I'm no longer in my working space. I'm in a display space. And what happens if instead of Rec 709, I don't want Rec 709, I want P3 D65000 nit? Well, there is no P3 D65000 nit Kodak 2383 LUT built in here to Resolve, is there? So no, we cannot use these LUTs in a color managed workflow in the way they are intended to be used. And we always want to use LUTs in the way they were intended to be used. We don't want to go rogue and just use them any way we think might work, because we're going to get unexpected results and we may or may not get them initially. And when we do, we're going to realize, oh God, I have to redo my entire stack because everything is living underneath this problematic implementation of my look or whatever it is I was trying to accomplish. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. One that you can use for print film emulation is my Kodak 2383 DWG to DWG. Let's turn these two off and turn this guy on. And you've now got Kodak 2383 colorimetry that's designed to happen inside of a color managed pipeline. So there is no display transform in this LUT. It's just the creative aspect of that 2383 film print. That is 100% free. There's a link to it in the description to this video. You can grab it on cullenkellycolor.com. It is 100% free, and it's a way of getting film print character inside of a color managed workflow because as we have answered with this question, we unfortunately cannot use these built-in film looks LUTs inside of a color managed pipeline.
Okay. Is there any reason why setting color space transform to use timeline in DaVinci Wide Gamut projects look different than manually setting the color space transform to DaVinci Wide Gamut / intermediate? Shouldn't that be identical?
It should be identical, although I'll give you my answer. Do you want to know how many times I have used the use timeline setting anywhere in Resolve this year? None. I just don't trust it. Even in the best case scenario, even if it is indeed identical and there is no discrepancy, which it sounds like you may be experiencing, even if there is no discrepancy, it's just too easy to rock the boat when you have any transform that is invoking the use timeline option here, because that means all you have to do is go into your color management, if you're in DaVinci YRGB, for example, and switch this. And all of a sudden, a bunch of color space transforms may switch as well. So I always encourage in both color space transforms as well as on the deliver page, don't take the bait. Use timeline seems like a really cute, convenient thing, but it takes an extra 5 seconds to just explicitly state what your true color space is. And it's worth the effort. It's worth knowing that no matter what else happens in this project, that setting is not going to move or become inaccurate because I have explicitly declared what I want it to be. So short answer, no, there shouldn't be. Long answer, there can be. And there are also other good reasons to simply avoid that use timeline bait and manually set it every single time, both here on the deliver page as well as in your color space transform.
Hence, the colorist wants to know if you do much work or have many nodes after the ODT, Rec 709 or HDR, or if you do all your work and you're grading pre-ODT.
Pre-ODT, for sure. I just don't see any advantage to doing a display-based thing. Unless I were, like, here's the one exception that I would give that has come up maybe twice in my career. If we are grading for a hero display that is not properly calibrated or that has some sort of aberrant characteristic to it, but we really want that display to look proper, that's the one case where if I'm compensating for a misbehavior or an aberration in one particular display due to the fact that it is not dead on to what the spec, to its like stated spec, I might do some kind of trim or tweak after the display transform, because that's what I actually want to affect things in display space. Make like a little bit of a gamma drop or whatever, but that's like a phenomenally rare thing. Like I said, that's maybe happened twice in my career. Other than that, there's no reason, and certainly no good reason to do it. You're better off making the adjustment in your big, wide photometric scene space and just letting that adjustment ripple out into your display. The only reason I could see why you wouldn't want to do that is the one that I just gave, where it's like, well, no, I don't actually want that tweak to affect my HDR and my theatrical. I just want it to affect this particular display rendering that I'm doing. So I'm going to make my tweak downstream in there. Even in that case, I'm going to try to figure out, okay, well, what's going on here? Why is that? Because I really shouldn't have to do that. If I have the right transform and the display is properly calibrated, I should be dead on, and I don't want to try to compensate with color grading tools for any inaccuracy. If there's a better solution, I'd like to find it. In a pinch, I have done that before, just not very often.
Okay, Photogabi wants to congratulate you for the baby, first of all.
Thank you.
And then ask, is there any advantage debayering a Blackmagic Raw source in Camera Raw to DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, or is an input color space transform method more efficient?
Efficiency, I don't think is a factor. I can tell you that when I work with B-Raw, if And by the way, the question, just for any of us who aren't following along, is if we look at our project settings and our camera raw tab over here, under our Blackmagic Raw, we have the option of debayering. If we select project for our decode using here, we have the option of debayering into a bunch of different color spaces, which is kind of cool. And the question is there any advantage or disadvantage to just debayering directly into my working color space if it's offered up to me? In the case of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, it is. I could do it like so. I can tell you guys in my practice, if my working color space is on this menu and I'm grading B raw, I'm just going to debayer directly into it. I don't see any reason to crowd my project with another node or with another input transform. If I can have it debayer directly into the space I want, why the hell not? Especially if, as is the case with DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate is larger than the color space and gamma that are being natively used for B-Raw. So it's not like anything's being clipped or clamped or distorted in that debayer. This DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate color space is perfectly capable of containing the entirety of a B-Raw negative inside of itself, at least as capable as any other color space that we might debayer into, such as Blackmagic Design Film. So no, I don't think there's any disadvantage to doing this at all. And in fact, I think there's some advantage because it's one less link in the chain that you have to worry about anywhere else in your project. So I say go for it. The only other thing that you could contemplate is like, well, what's the math under the hood that's being used to debayer into this versus that? And is there better math that I might avail myself of through a DCTL or a color space transform or whatever? It's a valid question, except in this case, it's all one manufacturer. It's all Blackmagic. They made the hardware, they made the software, and we can reasonably assume that when I debayer into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, the exact same math is being used as if I were to debayer into the default Blackmagic Film, whatever that setting is, and then color space transform it, because it's all the same manufacturer producing all of these transforms for their hardware and in their software, if that makes sense.
How do you work with the heavy highlight roll-off of DaVinci Wide Gamut at 4,000 plus nits? I feel like it sometimes prevents me from placing my highlights where I want them to go.
Oh, good question. This was one that I was kind of bummed we didn't get to talk about last week. It usually comes up. And by the way, quick tangent for everybody. Next week, actually during our normal grade school time, I'm going to be doing a webinar for Blackmagic Design on color management. That is going to dovetail really nicely into everything that we've been talking about. So grade school, we will announce for a slightly different hour next week, but definitely encourage you to come check out that webinar. It's free. I'll post a link to it in the YouTube community after we finish here today. All you have to do is register, and then we can hang out for 2 hours in there, and it's a really nice dovetail into a lot of these same topics that we're talking about with DaVinci Wide Gamut. But back to the question, in terms of that roll-off inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, it's a valid question. The question is basically, how do I creatively navigate the fact that by default, when I look at my DaVinci YRGB color managed, if I go to like my DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate here, it's not explicitly stated, because nothing is explicitly stated when I select this processing mode, because it's kind of an automagic thing that's meant to get me on my feet quickly. But where this question is arising from is the fact that regardless of my input dynamic range from my original source, let's just say for the sake of example, I don't think I have anything that quite fits this example here in the timeline, but let's just say, oh, I don't know. Let's look at this shot here, okay? And let me just make sure we've got all of our mapping and stuff happy. Let's turn that back off. Go back to the default kind of look that we set up here. So it's not the case, but let's just say on this shot that we actually have a full range of like 0 to like a 10,000 nit ceiling. Like we're really pinging things with like this hot highlight. That's probably not 10,000. In fact, I'm sure it's not. But like you could imagine, big wide exterior of a lake at sunset. You're going to get 10,000 nit values pinging off of that water when you do that, or from the sun itself for that matter. So the question is, the observation that the question is coming from is the fact that when we input map into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, by default, we are actually having our highlights rolled down to 4,000 nits. When I say rolled, I mean compressed. So we're not clipping, but we're taking what starts as 0 to 10,000 and on the input mapping, compressing down to 0 to 4,000. Okay. Why that's the default, I don't really know. I think for some reason the engineers felt that would be a better fit for most users. Maybe they want to get a bit more compression in the highlights, a bit less ping. But I like this question because I have the same question. How do I get more ping and less roll in my highlights? The answer is to go back to our project settings here and change our color processing mode to custom. And I just want to point out to you guys here that when I do that, these settings represent what this preset is. So I'm not going to see any change between these. It's just that now I have access to all of the underlying parameters of this HDR DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate preset, including this one right here, my timeline working luminance. So the way I deal with that roll is I get rid of it. I don't like it. I don't want it. I tell Resolve, I want all 10,000 nits. I want the full container. If I need to roll something, I'll roll it. If it's not happening in the way I want already at the display stage, because we already know we're going to do a big highlight compression at the display transform stage. If I need to do some intermediate compression, I'm going to want to do that individually on a shot basis and by eye, by taste. So I don't want there to be this across the board compression of 10,000 to 4,000 nits on my input. But that is the default when we are working inside of this HDR DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate preset. So this is a great example of when we might choose to go off the reservation and say, hey, I love how easy it is to just select this, but I want to change the behavior of my highlight roll-off, so I'm going to change things in a custom mode here. So this is the way I actually work. When I'm working in DaVinci or Resolve Color Management, I'm going to go to Custom, go to 10,000 nit, and I'm going to set my input DRT to none. And all I'm doing with those two things is saying, don't mess with my dynamic range. I will figure out the dynamic range. If the dynamic range is not being sufficiently solved in my output transform, I will deal with things on an individual shot basis by hand and as needed, but I don't want a global transformation to be taking place at the input stage of all of my different clips. So it's a great question. And the way I would deal with it, the easiest, most neutral place to start with this, in my opinion, is to set that working luminance to the absolute ceiling of 10,000, and then to set the input DRT to none, so that now you're not getting any of that roll off, and the only roll off that's happening is at the output stage. You guys have heard me talk before about how roll off is our friend, curves are our friend, nonlinear things are our friend, but we want to be aware of and very decisive about where we are introducing roll off and compression into our chain. We don't want to do it too many times, and we want to do it at the right stage and in the right measure. So for me, this is what that looks like, to say, yeah, we're going to roll off at the output stage, but not at the input stage. And just to round that out, like, let's just see, I don't know if over YouTube and with whatever this value is living at, we'll see a change, but we might. Let's hit save here and see if we see any change up here in this light fixture. Can't see it. Maybe if I had my HDR monitor, I would have seen that flip a little bit, but good enough for now.
Okay, is it a proper way to use a camera LUT in a workflow like DaVinci Wide Gamut or ACES? For example, if a cinematographer shot for a specific LUT, but we would like to work in DaVinci Wide Gamut or ACES.
Yeah, it's a good question. So again, I'm going to try to keep myself reasonably brief here. So here's the fun thing that, like, this DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow series that we're working our way through, sort of the world that it opens up to us is like the world of color management. Everything is a form of color management. Okay. So it's just a question of how good it is and the form it's coming in. So just as an example, we were talking about these film LUTs before. It's kind of a primitive version of it, but this LUT is offering a form of color management. And in fact, like, if we go all the way back to photochemical color timing, the color management framework in place was encoded right into the behavior of the film print. The film print was doing the job of color managing the negative, which is something that is not ready to be viewed by the naked eye. the print is doing the job of transforming that scene state image into a display state image. It's a primitive form of color management, also a very effective one. It's the only one that we had for theatrical exhibition for, I don't know, a century. So these film LUTs are kind of similar in that way. They're like, all right, we're going to take some sort of Cineon log negative density image, and we are going to translate it into a display state. So that's a form of color management. Camera LUTs provided by manufacturers, those are offering color management. That's really all they are there for, is to say, hey, we know that my Sony or my Arri or my Canon doesn't shoot in a display state. And we know that you're probably sooner than later going to want to see the image that you shot on a display. So we, the manufacturer, have prepared for your viewing pleasure this LUT. Okay. And the different manufacturers produce different LUTs that have different quality. And in fact, if we look at like the impact that that's had on like brand loyalty, one of the reasons that we all love Arri so much, yes, it's a great camera, but they also made a really good LUT to accompany that camera that isn't quite the same case in the case of like something like Sony or maybe even Canon. But to answer the question, if we have a cinematographer who has shot something in a or underneath a camera LUT, we should say, and we now want to color manage and we don't necessarily want to use that camera LUT, the short answer is no, we can't use that camera LUT inside of our color management because they are competing solutions. You know, it's like saying, do you want to, I don't know, like, do you want, they are aimed at the same solution. So you can really only use one at a time properly. What you can do is evaluate like, okay, like here's what I might do if I were brand new and I'd never seen an Alexa transform before. And my, DP is telling me, let me just go back to manual here for a second. This is going to be a longish answer, but I think it's a good question, and this is worthy stuff here. So let's say that I have discovered that baseline for my creatives for a project that I'm grading is Arri Alexa log C to 7 or 9, the K1S1, so-called Arri LUT. This is Arri material, and all they did for monitoring and then for maybe generating all of their editorial files was slap this LUT on there. So this is the baseline for them. This is what their image looks like. So it's a good question. It's like, all right, how do we like meet them at that point before we go off into a completely new direction? So what I would do as a baseline is grab a still here, maybe apply this LUT to every shot in the timeline, like so. If I just grab everything and apply it, and if I do a quick grab all stills type of thing, it's just going to grab a still from every single shot in the timeline. And what I'm going to do after these stills finish grabbing is wipe out this LUT from every single shot and just flip over to my color management and get a sense for how close or different they may be. And here's the fun part about color management. Whatever discrepancy I do observe, I can tighten or I can lessen with my look, if that's my intent. They're not going to be a world away here, but if I look at if these stills ever finish grabbing, these two are not going to be very far flung. Resolve Color Management versus Arri's K1S1, I can tell you just from memory that they're not terribly far flung. But let's go back to the beginning here. Let's look at a face. Okay, so we're here. I'm going to go ahead and reset all of my shots like so. And let's turn my color management back on. Like so. And now I can compare, here's what DaVinci Wide Gamut or Resolve Color Management did to this image, and here's what Arri's K1S1 did. So they're actually quite similar, aren't they? But here's the good part. If I wanted to tighten that similarity, but still use a proper color management workflow and not just be stuck with a single LUT, I could address that at my look level if I so wanted. So I could cool or desaturate my highlights a little bit if I wanted to do that. I could, whatever discrepancy I observed and I wanted to tighten, I could address at my look level here if I wanted to do that. Maybe with something like that, for example. And then maybe I would do a little bit of contrast underneath that if I really wanted to tighten that match. That would be one option. Now, another option would be, you could, like just to state it out loud, There have been many, many films graded underneath the ARRI K1S1 LUT. That is a form of color management. There's nothing wrong with that. Same way that there's nothing technically wrong with grading underneath one of the Resolve Film LUTs. Those work great. The only challenge is when we want to target a different display than Rec. 7 or 9, right? At least in the case of ARRI, if you look into it a little bit more, there's actually a family of matching transforms for different display intents that you can get from ARRI. With these Resolve Film LUTs, as I mentioned earlier, they actually only exist as SDR, so you're really kind of painted into a corner once you decide to start using that for both your look and your color management. But for ARRI, if your client loves the ARRI look, if they're bought into the ARRI look and you don't want to try to match to that and you feel like that's just a waste of effort to try and tighten a match to something that they're already really happy with, just use the ARRI K1S1 LUT. And if they want to do an HDR thing, then you can get your hands on the entire ARRI family of transforms here and say, okay, now I want to do an ST2084 Rec 2020 thing, or I want to do like whatever the case may be. You've got a matching family of those in the case of ARRI. So that would be kind of how I would think about that, at least with ARRI. Again, like with different manufacturers, your mileage may vary. And in general, I'm going to pitch to you that most of the time, sound color management with just a little bit of a look, something that you would get from my free 2383 or from my Core Elements LUTs that are also available on cullenkellycolor.com. That's what I'm using right here. You're generally going to get, let's do this like so. You're going to get better results just from some simple color management and some sound like look LUTs here than a camera manufacturer LUT is going to give you. Those LUTs don't tend to be great. They tend to be kind of aimed at selling cameras as opposed to reproducing great images for, like any scenario or, like getting you the best possible reproduction of your camera negative in a display, which is the aim of color management. So usually it's worth exploring and saying, hey, let's wean ourselves off the camera LUT. I know we all like it. If there are specific things you want me to borrow from it, I will. But let's get into a proper color management workflow and compensate as needed with a look. We're generally going to be happier there than with using a camera manufacturer provided LUT. Boy, long answer, but hopefully helpful stuff.
Okay, let's go to color models. Why is that HSL or HSV color models are still a popular option when LCH offers perceptual uniformity? Does it make a difference if it looks good anyway?
Well, the last part, does it make a difference if it what?
If it looks good anyway?
Good question. So no, not necessarily. And I'm actually really glad this came out because it's something I've been experimenting with a ton. It's another tangent I could go into at length. I'm going to suffice it to say this. There are dozens of so-called what I would call cylindrical or conical or circular color models where we have a cylinder where the radius around that cylinder represents hue. The distance from the core or the middle of that cylinder represents saturation, and the altitude, meaning how low or high the pixel plots on that cylinder, represents luminance. There are a ton of different models that work with such a coordinate system, and we just listed off a couple of them. There's LCH-AB, there's LCH-UV, there's, oh my goodness, I can't help myself. Here is a very incomplete list of, let's see. I actually trimmed my DCTLs for this session. There's a lot. JZ, AZ, BZ, IPT, tons and tons and tons of models that translate RGB into that cylinder in slightly different ways and that give you better, to answer the question, hue, or to reference the question, hue uniformity, meaning that the hues actually transition at even intervals and they feel more perceptually linear. There's trade-offs to both, but no, like the short answer is if you can get good results out of it, then no, there's no disadvantage. And there may actually be an advantage because like if I look at translating into what I call like a generic YCH model, which is not the same as LCH-AB, it's just generically saying, hey, you know how my color is normally a cube? It's a box, it's a cardboard box sitting on the ground. Just turn that whole box on its side. So stand it up on the corner, on the bottom corner of the box. So now the box is a diamond. Does that make sense? That's all that YCH is doing. There's no perceptual like hue preservation going on. The math is dirt simple. It's literally just geometry, just saying, hey, take this and turn it around like that. So you're not getting all that fancy hue uniformity and perceptual uniformity that you might want, but it's also dirt simple and nothing ever breaks. And it's very, very easy and like cost-free to translate and travel in between those spaces. So there are advantages to both, to like explicitly defined color models that have color space as well, versus just generic color models like HSL or YCH that are just translating whatever your RGB space is into a different coordinate system. That can be really useful as well. And absolutely, if you can get good results out of it, that's just as useful, and in many cases more useful than an explicitly rigidly defined space. That's a pretty advanced topic to be discussing here in grade school, but glad the question came up. Let's get back to basics. Anything else on DaVinci Wide Gamut, or have we pretty well covered that?
Well, let's go to a basic question then. What's the benefit of transforming a display state image into an scene referred space and then go back to the display space?
Good question. I'm going to answer that briefly because we have covered it before, and if I remember, I'm going to pull up a link to the episode of grade school where we discussed it. But there's a couple of benefits that we could summarize really in 2 points. The first is that by transforming a display state image back to a scene state, we can target different displays, right? So it's all good and well. Like the really common form of this is like, okay, I've got a bunch of Rec 7 or 9 stuff, and I'm outputting Rec 7 or 9. What's the deal? Why would I try to translate into like a scene or a log or a working space when I've already got the color space that I want on either side? The first reason is for that flexibility that we started off today's session with talking about. It's like, well, just because you're doing SDR today doesn't mean you won't be doing HDR tomorrow. And when you are, you no longer have a sensible starting point, and you're going to have to rethink your entire grade. So that's point number one. Point number two is that when we grade the space that we are in, as we talked about earlier with our question about lift, gamma, gain, and offset and the perceptual linearity of those controls change and they feel different, and we get different results out of them depending on the state of our image, right? Now, your mileage may vary. The only way for you to know the answer to this question is to put in the time, but I can tell you 10 times out of 10, I would rather grade on a log state than a gamma state image. Gamma state images are no fun to grade on. They just feel graphical. I feel like I'm in a box. And when I'm grading a log state image, even if that log state image started as a gamma state image when I received it, I can generally think and operate in a more holistic and more photographic manner, a more intuitive manner, to be honest, because I'm operating on the image in a better state for manipulating it, as opposed to gamma, where I just feel like my hands are tied when I'm operating on a gamma image. It's like, you can't go too far down because you're going to clip. Can't go too high up because you're going to clip. Can't go left, can't go right. Everything has to kind of operate within this very narrow window in order to get proper results. So those would be the two reasons. A, just because you are spitting out 7 or 9 today doesn't mean you won't want to spit out something else tomorrow. And B, the state that your image is in when you operate on it has a huge impact on the results that you get and on how the experience, how efficient and effective you are as an artist. So that would be the other advantage to moving into a more intuitive and photographic space like a log space.
Okay, a question from Ahmad Irfan. Those ACEs also provide a change in the timeline working luminance to 10,000 nits?
Good question. ACEs does not luminance map on input stage. It only luminance maps at the output. So we don't have that same control. And it's without going into a whole detour here. That's a great example of the kind of granular control that we have with DaVinci Wide Gamut that we don't have with ACEs. As I've talked about before, that can be good or that can be bad. Depends on whether you want manual control. I've got a buddy who drives a stick shift Porsche, and he would not be happy to open up his car one morning and find that it had been replaced with an automatic transmission. However, if I asked my wife if she would like a car with a manual transmission, she would say, no, I just want an automatic shifter so I can get to where I'm get from point A to point B. So it depends on your needs and your wants. Neither is better than the other, but that is a key discrepancy between ACES and DaVinci Wide Gamut. We have more control with DaVinci Wide Gamut if we care to exert it.
Is there any difference between changing the color space / gamma in a node mode versus color space transforms?
Well, only a change in terms of like our access to the image. So like when we change our color space in a node like so, I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this. All right, so the two things to be aware of. First of all, we had a question earlier, a really good question about like, hey, how does gamut mapping when we're doing automatic or project level color management in Resolve? It's like, well, we actually don't quite know because we don't have an explicit option for that. Similarly, if I am in whatever, DaVinci Wide Gamut here, and I say, I want to change my color space to Rec 709, I could test this, I just never have. I actually don't know what kind of gamut mapping is happening on either end of that, or if any gamut mapping is happening. Maybe it doesn't, maybe there is none, and it may be that I don't want that, but that's something I don't have control over here. Whereas if I were to build a bookended set of color space transforms to and from Rec 709, I would have control over that. So there's some extra control with a color space transform that we don't have here. And the other thing to be aware of is that you are, depending on what you're trying to do, your changes here only affect the operations within this node, right? That sounds obvious, but like you're starting in DaVinci Wide Gamut right here at this green triangle, and you are ending with DaVinci Wide Gamut here at this green square. It's just that you're operating in Rec 709 in between, in this case. So if that's what you want, that's great. But if you actually want to transform your image state beyond the like the confines of the specific node that you're in, then selecting your color space here is a bad choice. And that's something that kind of confused me for a while, but it's just worth stating out loud, is like these color space and gamma options here only last for as long as the node lasts. As soon as you move into a new node, these things no longer have an effect. So you're not permanently transforming, you're creating a round trip or a bookended transform that begins and ends right here inside of this node. We got time for one or two more here.
Okay. Is it possible to export color space transforms into a LUT? Like if I wanted to load your DaVinci Wide Gamut 2383 LUT to my Pocket 4K, can I put the DaVinci Wide Gamut color space sandwich into a LUT?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you can. Your color space transforms are on the sort of like whitelisted set of OpenFX plugins that actually will cook into a LUT properly. So if we wanted to do like, here's an easy example. Let's turn our project level color management off. If we just wanted to do like, hey, I want to give I know I want to use Cullen's Kodak 2383 for this project, and I know I'm going to use Resolve Color Management. I'm just going to do everything here at the clip level, like so. Just bear with me. So here would be a simplified version of a pipeline I've already done a couple times today, where I'm going from, let's see here, log C to DaVinci Wide Gamut. I am applying my 2383 in DaVinci Wide Gamut as it's designed to work, and then I'm outputting that to Rec 709. If I want to create a viewing LUT for my Alexa shoot that's coming up, I could right click. I can say generate LUT, do a 17 or 33 or whatever, and all three of those pieces are going to cook into this LUT. I could give this LUT to the camera department and say, hey, here's your LUT. Have fun. Shoot under this. And that means they're going to have the proper ratio and previewing environment to actually see what the image is going to look like when it runs through my pipeline when we get into grading. So yes, absolutely. You could do this or whatever other variation you wanted to include with like of mixing color space transforms and LUTs, and then cook that all down into a new LUT and use it as a viewing or a camera LUT as needed. What else?
Okay. How would you recommend I work with the contrast and hue versus shade curves underneath your film LUT? I'm looking for a way to solve the issue with the perceived lack of saturation.
Oh, yes, I saw this question. This is a really good one. So this is a really good opportunity to talk about something that, again, I talk about in the Colorist 10 Commandments that I'm going to keep encouraging you guys to pick up. It's $17. It's worth $17. You're going to buy $17 in books at some point this year. Go pick it up if you're serious about your craft. It's a distillation of 10 plus years of concepts that I've been developing for my practice that takes all the ideas we talk about every week in grade school and distills them down into 10 principles that you can carry around with you. And one of those principles that I talk about in the book is that we want to be thinking about, we want to always be thinking about how we can most simply accomplish our goals. And another idea that I mentioned, I forget in which chapter, that is one that I always keep in mind is like, anytime I'm thinking about anything, about like this challenge, for example, like I want to overcome the fact that this 2383 transform can feel a little bit uncolorful. Okay, that's true. That's a valid assessment. If we compare, you know, like let's look at a more kind of like colorful frame. Like this one's pretty good here. And let's apply this stack that I was just working on here. So if I flip this 2383 off and on, that's a fair assessment. It is technically less colorful or perceptually less colorful. So the question was like, how could I work with contrast or my curves controls to overcome this? It's a good question, but I think the better question is, what is the ideal way to modulate the intensity of this sort of like desaturation effect that I'm getting out of this LUT? Okay. One option might be, rather than to add something on top of or underneath this LUT, one option might just be to cut it in half. That's not bad. And now instead of adding something, we're taking something away, which is much better. That kind of goes back to what we were talking about with power windows earlier. It's better to take stuff away than it is to add things. It's better to sculpt down than it is to stack up, right? So that would be my go-to here, is to see if I could find a sensible level for my key output gain with this LUT to get things into a better spot without needing to add a transformation underneath. Now, if you wanted to do something underneath, you could do that as well. I would probably, as my go-to there, look at either my loom versus sat, or even better, or not necessarily even better, but as another option, my sat versus sat, and just say, okay, here in the bottom end, I'm going to try to pick things up and add some additional saturation where the saturation is lowest, if that makes sense. So I'm not going to mess with the higher saturations that are happening up here, but at the bottom, I'm going to kind of draw a curve so that I'm increasing sat in the lower regions. However, this works, but if this works and key output gain on the LUT, if those both work equally well, which is better? This one, right? Because it's simpler, because we're doing less, because we're taking things away as opposed to adding things on. So great question. That would be how I would think about that, and some of the solutions that you might use to actually solve the problem. Okay, that's another hour, guys. Great session. I'm actually really glad we got to do a follow-up on part one, even though it's due to me slacking on my pre-recorded video that I owe you guys, so that you'll be seeing that next week. And then I'm really excited to continue talking about DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow after you've had a chance to check out that video and get some new questions saved up for the next session. So thank you guys for joining today. Thanks to Rafa for being my co-host with the most, as always. Hope you guys have an awesome weekend and an awesome upcoming week, and we will see you guys for the next episode of Grade School. Take care.